Well, good afternoon, everyone. We're thrilled to be presenting a timely webinar called Confronting Ecocide and Achieving Environmental Dignity. It's the third of a three-part series about ethnocide. It's sponsored in part by the American Bar Association Center for Human Rights and its Dignity Rights Initiative, which emphasizes the foundational role of human dignity in achieving a just and sustainable rule of law. It's also sponsored in part by the ABA section for Civil Rights and Social Justice. My name is Jimmy May, and I'm a part of the Center for Human Rights and its Dignity Rights Initiative. During today's program, we encourage you to ask questions of our panelists through Q&A, not the chat function. If you don't see the controls, please ensure that your screen isn't idle, and I'll be monitoring the Q&A, and we'll do our best to address your questions, time permitting. We'll be sharing a recording of this program with everyone who is registered so that you can share it widely within your networks. So let me first tell you a little bit about human dignity and contextualize today's conversation about ethnocide and ecocide. So human dignity is the nucleus of a just rule of law. It embodies the principle that all human beings have equal, inherent, and inalienable worth. It's recognized in thousands of juridical decisions by domestic, regional, and international tribunals. Accordingly, in 2019, the American Bar Association unanimously adopted a resolution that recognizes human dignity as foundational to the rule of law in America and outside of America. And while it's difficult to forecast exactly what this means in every context, and including the ways that we're talking about today, what's evident is that human dignity under law has untapped potential to improve outcomes in a vast array of practices of law and in life. So in March, we had a conversation about ethnocide and dignity with one of our panelists today, Barrett Holmes Pittner, about his new book, which I'll introduce in a moment, but about how a crime can be defined without the language to do so, and the history and impacts of ethnocide in America. And Barrett was providing the language to help us identify how to talk about outcomes with ethnocide. And then the following month in April, we sponsored a webinar that examined current manifestations of ethnocide with Aaron Daly, including topics about Russia's invasion of Ukraine, to sociopolitical forces at play today and in the US, and both their effects on and their implications for the future of the rule of law at home and abroad. So the common feature throughout those first programs in March and in April is the person I'll introduce first. It's Barrett Holmes Pittner. Let me tell you a little bit about him. He's a columnist, journalist, and philosopher whose work has been published in the Daily Beast, BBC, The Guardian, and elsewhere. He's the founder of the Sustainable Culture Lab, a cultural think tank with the goals of influencing policy by working with legislators and decision makers and impacting culture at the grassroots level through events, work, and cultural offerings. He lives in Washington, D.C., and he's the author of a groundbreaking book, The Crime Without a Name, Ethnocide and the Erasure of Culture in America. He'll be joined today by Scott Badenoch. So Scott's an international human rights and environmental justice attorney who served in a variety of leadership roles as a member of the American Bar Association section on civil rights and social justice. He's a visiting attorney at the Environmental Law Institute, where he founded BRIGHT, a program to facilitate sustainable development in overburdened communities, and the ELI, Pro Bono Clearinghouse, connecting environmental justice communities with pro bono attorneys willing to represent them. He's recently represented human rights defender and environmental attorney Stephen R. Donziger in U.S. versus Donziger, a Second Circuit case. So let me welcome our speakers. It's great to have you aboard. Thank you so much for taking time, those of you who are listening. And I was hoping we can begin, Barrett, with you to tell us about the meaning of ethnocide. And then Scott, we could turn over to you after that to tell us the meaning of ecocide. Thank you again so much for joining us.
Yep, Jimmy, thanks for that wonderful introduction, and thank you ABA for having me. So, real quick to give a definition of ethnocide. Quick backstory: the word was first coined in 1944 by Raphael Lemkin, who coined the word genocide at the same time. The words were used to describe the atrocity inflicted upon the Jewish people during the Holocaust. And and he intended for the words to essentially be interchangeable. Ethnocide's literally in the footnotes of his book. But genocide became the word that everyone recognized, and ethnocide kind of lived in the shadows for a while. Around the 1970s, the word kind of came back and it got a new definition that distinguished itself from genocide. And this definition was that it was the destruction of people's culture while keeping the people, while genocide is largely the destruction of the people and their culture dies with them. Ethnocide, the culture dies and the people remain. And much of that work was in the 70s was focused on indigenous people and the schools that were created in the Americas to try to eradicate indigenous culture and make them westernized people. But with my work and my book, The Crime Without a Name, Ethnocide and the Erasure of Culture in America, I use the language of ethnocide to describe the transatlantic slave trade, because the goal of that was to get African people and intentionally, systematically, forcefully destroy all of their African culture so that colonizers in the Americas could have an oppressed group of people within a perpetually divided society and build their society around that. And the structure, the foundational structure of ethnocide still shape America today. Much of our relationship with guns and the normalization of division and how we treat the environment and how we treat each other and the absence of dignity, innate human worth in our discourse and our laws derives from this ethnocidal foundation. Because if you are going to, forcefully destroy over 1 million Africans' culture, you're not going to believe that they have innate human dignity as you do that. You'll come up with justifications to say that they don't. And these are the ideas that helped found the United States. And we still are addressing this absence of dignity with literally everything that we do. And that includes the environment. Because when you think about why this undignified relationship was forged between colonizer and enslaved person, it was so that the enslaved person could remake the land for the profit of colonizers. And so the land got completely remade, not in a way to nurture and sustain people, but to create wealth for people who are oppressing essentially a continent of people. And this continues and influences ecocide. And with that, I'll pass over to Scott, who's our expert on ecocide.
Well, thank you. I can't say I'm an expert on the very new legal definition of ecocide, and that's what I just posted. Kudos to an incredible team of lawyers who have been working fastidiously to come up with this legal definition that would be infused into the Rome statute that is the underpinning of the International Criminal Court. So that's a very specific effort. And but the legal definition of ecocide is older than that, but it's exactly what you would expect. It's the destruction of an ecology or an environment intentionally or negligently with your acts, whatever those may be. And that's the sort of simple definition. But this attempt to codify ecocide as an international crime is new and important, and yet is still nascent and has not really taken hold. The ICC has not moved to pass this yet. There are rumblings that these sorts of things could happen. The biggest development lately is that France has passed a national sort of ecocide law, which is very interesting. But the destruction of the environment, and typically that is from corporate endeavors, but of course militaries are brutal when it comes to destroying environments. One of the things that is least talked about in the war in Ukraine is, and the invasion by Russia is the destruction of ecologies that are clearly happening, and the destruction of those fields by the toxic materials that's in those war machines and the armaments they use. So this is ecocide in action, sort of in parallel to war. But what we're talking about today is how ecocide is in parallel to ethnocide and how those two sort of interrelate. And I frequently say that the Venn diagram is quite tight on those two. But I'll leave it at that for now.
So thanks both of you for contextualizing the conversation. Scott, let me start with you with any examples that come to mind that exhibit the connection between ethnocide and ecocide, and then Barrett, you'll come next. Thank you.
Well, I'll just give one example that I'll give one example that's very straightforward, which is the Chevron Ecuador case. The willingness of Western extractive industries to see the world as just a source of commodities that they will go extract and turn into profit. Underlying that belief that that's an okay thing to do is ethnocide. Why do I know that? Because if they valued those cultures, they wouldn't seek them out to destroy them to get the mine, whatever's being mined, or the logs, or the whatever they're going for. If they saw that culture as valuable and connected to that land, they would be less willing to destroy all of that, right? So ethnocide has to precede in most of these situations the ecocide that is then a ramification of the ethnocide. The unwillingness to see these humans as equal to you in dignity and the rights of their, of their own to live in the way that they seek, not in a way that's influenced by, for instance, Chevron, who went into Ecuador and, I would say, to the definition of ecocide, they engaged in unlawful or wanton acts that destroyed mass ecologies. Right. And these were deliberate, and there was a severe likelihood that this was happening. They knew it. The facts were very, very clear. They left 1,000 open oil pits in the middle of the Amazon, unregulated, untreated, and still causing massive amounts of cancer and other diseases in that area. They've never cleaned it up. So this confluence of ethnocide and ecocide, I think, is a very stark one. But it's important to note that exact model is just emblematic. It's archetypical. It's not a one-off. That combo, when I see these sorts of levels of destruction in any international setting, I'm seeing that exact same combination, which is that a ruling elite or a corporate elite has decided that a certain people don't matter, their lives don't really matter, and their connection to the culture don't matter. And so what they do to get the commodities there, including employ these people at often, virtually indentured servitude sort of levels, and get the profit out of it. That's all they seek. So Chevron Ecuador is a great example, but we see this in corporate America all over the place because they see profit as more important than people or the planet. So whenever you put profit first, you're going to be willing to destroy the underlying cultures that are harboring those things that are called commodities.
Barrett, what are your thoughts about that? Thank you, Scott.
Yeah, I think Scott left it at a really key point to think about it, where when I talk about ethnocide and its relationship with the United States, it encompasses what occurred to indigenous people, and it also I focus on the transatlantic slave trade because that's uniquely just ethnocide. It's not a mixture of ethnocide and genocide. It's we're getting people, they're forcibly putting people on boats, actively trying to destroy their culture so that a cultureless mass of people can then be enslaved in the Americas and forced to work on land and remake that land for, like a monocrop for the enrichment of colonizers. And so when you look at ethnocide, the motivation at the beginning of that was money. So this desire to prioritize money over human dignity is one of the ways that they've always articulated why ethnocide is beneficial. It's something that's just, it's natural to happen. And so even today, we have a lot of language that devalues human life because you get some sort of monetary exchange for that. And I think that's a really key thing to think about, because a lot of our language, because we live in a place that's ethnocidal, encourages this discourse, this perspective where, doing something detrimental to another person is beneficial if you get money in exchange or if it supports a company or whatnot. And so when you look at the layout of just America, much of the land that was remade, and it looks absolutely no way how it doesn't look like how it looked before colonization, that was remade by enslaved people. And so the ethnocide was the precursor that then allowed that ecocide to occur. And then another thing that happens with this is you start having this narrative of good land and bad land, where the land where wealthy people live, that's good. The land where oppressed people work for the enrichment of wealthy people, that's good. But where the people who are oppressed live, that land is bad. And that's where you can throw waste. That's where you can make sure they have food deserts and they don't have the resources that they need, all of that stuff. And then that right there, this negligent, disconnected relationship to the environment ends up destroying the environment, because the waste that's in the neighborhood that's primarily people of color, that waste is going to flow and not just live right in that environment. It's going to infect everywhere. And we have a culture that normalizes that relationship. I remember in political science, when I was in college, there was a term that we learned, and we still use it to this day, that's not in my backyard. They just say NIMBY, where Americans will just say, like, something that's bad, I'll agree that it's bad. And the solution is to put it in somebody else's backyard. The solution isn't to figure out an actual solution. I just don't want to see it. Like, I'm too rich and I just don't want to see it. I know it's bad, so put the factory over there. And that right there is a narrative that's just destroys the environment. And we have that narrative of destroying the environment because we're putting the destructive things in the communities with the people that America brought here with the goal of destroying in the first place. And so it's all quite symbiotic, this destruction of people while they still live. So you destroy their culture, their soul, and then polluting the places in which they live to create a facade of the absence of pollution. But you can't, it doesn't work. And clearly, as climate change and, our water is polluted and all that kind of stuff, it shows that the environment is interconnected and they don't have a concern for property boundaries and absurd British ideas.
Yeah, I'll just say also one more thing about this. I think it's fundamental to the dignity rights discussion, which is there is a tug of war going on in international law between the age-old property rights-based laws that emanate out of property ownership as the fundamental sort of structure of the legal regime, versus rights that emanate from the human being themselves. And we would say the dignity right is the fundamental right. And then there are a bunch of sort of enumerated rights outside of that. Every human deserves fundamental dignity. It's the love thy neighbor sort of concept. But that would have to emanate from a human ideal that we come together as a community and say, that's how we want our laws to run. We want them to fundamentally run from human rights, not from ownership. And that structure has allowed this idea that the profits are more important than the people and the planet. And it's sort of become the mantra of capitalism is I am because I own. And if you don't own, you aren't anything. And so the indigenous folks that don't have a title to their land, they don't own it. So they're not important and they have no value. And therefore we can destroy all of that stuff. So, part of what we're doing as international lawyers and part of the beauty of international law is it's customary law, meaning what do we all agree to do and how many times do we do that? And if we start doing that more than we did the other stuff, then that will become the law. And if courts across the world begin to embrace dignity rights as the fundamental underpinning of the law, rather than property rights and ownership, then that could become the international legal standard. And I think that is part of Jimmy's work to show just how many courts are using dignity as a reason to rule, how many legislatures are using that language critically, and so on and so forth. And so this could become the international standard, and I really hope it does, because the concept of international law and domestic law emanating from property rights is antiquated and a root cause of a lot of this ethnocide and ecocide.
Yeah, thank you, Scott. The work that you mentioned about chronicling the extent to which dignity has found a home in courts, that was really pioneered by our friend Erin Daly and her work, and it was the focus of discussion from last month. For those of you who are interested in following up on that, that's a recorded program from last month, the conversation with Judge Bernice Donald and Erin and Barrett. And let me follow up with that with you, Barrett, about the role of, I mean, maybe dignity specifically, but more generally, how you see human rights affecting the relationship between ethnocide and the environment. Any thoughts you have about that? Thank you.
Well, I guess what I'd say, the relationship between human rights and ethnocide and the environment is culture has an attachment to place. I think this is a really important point. A lot of my work focuses on culture because ethnocide is the destruction of culture. And once you focus on that, the first question is, well, what is culture? And in America, a lot of times culture is perceived as a thing that you get access to when you have a certain amount of wealth. You know, you can become cultured. Culture is going to the theater or going to this thing, or certain groups might bring a culture with them, you know. But when you really break it down, culture is a collection of people's attachment to place and their commitment to create the things they need to survive in that particular place. And so the food you eat, the clothes you wear, all of that is part of the tapestry that makes the foundation of your culture. And your environment, without a doubt, is the root of your culture because your culture has an attachment to place. The US, since it's ethnocidal and it's been based around destroying the culture of the other, and that other is indigenous people, but also African people and other people of color, we don't cultivate a narrative where we have an attachment to this place in a way that's not dictated by money or industry or something. There's no like innate relationship. And I think that's a key thing that's missing regarding the conversation pertaining to human rights, ethnocide, and ecocide, where, you know, we almost talk about the environment as if it's, you know, second or third or fourth, but the environment's first. Like if we don't have a healthy environment, then we can't do any of the things that we need to do in the world. And that's because we have essentially like an inverted perspective or relationship with our own environment, where we like to believe, you know, or America likes to believe that, you know, westernized ideas precede the environment that is, you know, North America in which we live. No. The environment here precedes all of that. And for us to be healthy, we need to make sure that we have policies that nurture that environment. And we need policies to nurture the environment because we need it to nurture all of us, not just a segment of us. And that speaks to innate human dignity. And that's why when America has conversations pertaining to almost anything that's based on the collective benefit of our society, we don't like to do it, you know, or we'll talk about how it will be detrimental to business or something like that. And because we're not accustomed to thinking about the collective well-being of everybody. And likewise, we're not accustomed to thinking about the necessity of having a healthy environment because people didn't come here for either of those or colonizers didn't.
Right. So that's, I think that's so interesting, you know, this relationship between ethnocide and ecocide. And so Scott, my follow-up question for you is, do you think the two are inextricably intertwined? Is ecocide, which is the destruction of the environment, a necessary component of ethnocide, which is destruction of culture?
Yeah, it's a great question. I like I said earlier, I think the Venn diagram is incredibly tight. You could probably come up with some just emergency sort of mistakes that could somehow happen that could be without ethnocide. So I won't rule it out that there could be a ecocide without an ethnocide. But I would also say that most of our industrial activity as a society, even if it's done at the highest environmental standards and safety standards, when they cause an environmental disaster, which they still do, ethnocide was still underlying that. There was still a commitment that, like, yeah, there's a huge risk here, but that neighborhood's probably, I don't know, it's not that big of a concern. Well, why is that? Oh, because that neighborhood is a community of color and indigenous community. Oh, I got it. Okay, see why you don't care about that community. So there's, I think even when an ecocide situation is entirely by mistake or accident, there's enough risk in these issues that negligence becomes, and that's why the original definition was, if there's so much risk and you're not dealing with that appropriately, you could still be sort of liable, and just from a legal standard. But morally, I'd say if you're creating, any sort of large sort of thing like that, well, yeah, I see Pete say Flint. I worked on Flint as a pro bono lawyer for quite a while, and that case is another perfect example. The people of Flint and the culture there, which was predominantly Black, was not valued, and the willingness of the government officials and the consultants that approved it to switch to Flint water, which everyone knew was corrosive. It was not a secret. Everyone knew that stuff was disgusting. Was strictly because they didn't really care about the people, and they didn't see them as having dignity, and they didn't uphold the same dignity they would want others to uphold for them, for the people of Flint. And that's why 7,000 children were poisoned with lead. That's permanent, right? So there is absolutely no doubt about that. Flint is a perfect example, but let's also remember there are 1,000+ communities in the United States that don't have safe water. There are 1 million Californians that don't have access to potable water. I mean, so we have some very, very, very severe ongoing ecocide in America. We have your entire Superfund, all of the toxic sites that industry have created are all over these communities and are creating ecocide, are already ecocide, and are creating further ecocides and further cancers and other diseases. And no one's cleaning them up. Like these sites, 90% plus of these sites aren't cleaned up in America, right? So we point to like the Chevron Ecuadors because there's a scale there, and there was no EPA, so it's sometimes even more egregious. But there's places in America that I can show you that look like moonscapes. You would not believe some of the things we've done right here and never cleaned up. And those companies went bankrupt, and all the rich people that profited off it sort of split, and the law firms made tons of money. Law firms got all those billable hours, but those communities never got a penny, and those toxic sites are still rotting wherever they are. So, America has a lot to deal with in terms of ecocide and ethnocide right here, right now. And these corporations are continuing to try to do the same sorts of things all over this country.
Yeah. So Scott, again, that's just so interesting about the predictive nature of race and environmental outcomes. Study after study has shown that controlling for all other factors, education, wealth, income, the single most predictive factor for where a toxic waste site is located is race. And also about cleanup, the CERCLA law that you just mentioned or just alluded to has, cleanup standards and, requiring compliance with all applicable rules and laws, ARAR standards. And communities of color are far more likely, as you mentioned, not to be cleaned up, that the cleanup standard will be what's called natural attenuation, which means not doing anything. So Barrett, if I could ask you to globalize this ecocide and dignity theme, I'm wondering, because I can't think of anything, Barrett, so maybe this is like a loaded question, but are there any counterexamples? Are there any situations that you can think of historically that you recounted in your excellent book where ethnocide happened when ecocide didn't, or are the two hand in hand?
So I guess what I'd say is more often than not, ethnocide is first, because like ethnocide is not, you're not trying to exterminate a whole swath of people and create a society in their absence. You're doing things with the goal of having them in your society as perpetually oppressed people. And then those oppressed people, they're going to exist in your society to do the dirty work, to get all the stuff that you don't want to get. Like they're in the society to just get all of the suffering. And if that's how you're creating your society, where it's bifurcated at the very core, that's going to influence how you interact with anything and everything around you. You know, like if you've already bifurcated your society, then you're going to bifurcate the environment too, where there's going to be clean air over here and clean stuff over here and waste over there. And the waste over there is going to be in the people, is going to be on the people in their environment that you brought to the environment so that they get that waste. And so like when you talk about the United States, and we talk about race here in the US in such a perplexing way, because we know that people in Asia, people in Africa, people in Europe look the way they do because people from those areas just happen to look like that, but like white people don't look European in North America because white people are from North America, like that's not a thing. Black people aren't from here either. So if we had a society that was about equality, there would naturally just be like a whole new type of mixed race people. That would be a mixture of Europeans, indigenous people, Black people, all the people of the world that come here. They would just be a mixture. The racial distinctions that we have here are not based on place, because there's no place called white. There's no place called Black. Like if you're African, you are from Africa. Like that's a place. We're just given these racial classifications based on physical appearance because colonizers wanted to make sure they could distinguish between who were getting oppressed and who were going to be able to oppress. And so it's just a construct with titles that have no cultural connection, just a color affiliation. And we act as though this is just like a natural coincidence and not just like a systemic agenda based around dividing society so that one group of people can always get the short end of the stick. But that's clearly what it is. There's not any ambiguity. So, we'll do all this data, all this research and be like, what a coincidence. The Black communities, no matter how much money the Black person gets, that community is going to be more disadvantaged than the white one. Well, of course it is. That's the goal that America has set out since colonization. And so this is an example of how, clearly ethnocide precedes ecocide in so many ways. And when you look around the world, it's hard to find examples of ecocide not occurring in places without ethnocide, because colonization has consumed so much of the world, where all of these societies that are very westernized are foundationally divisive. We just act like that division is natural and not a massive, massive problem that leads to many other subsequent problems. And so, I'm sure you could find some examples of ecocide, but without ethnocide, but it's more important to recognize that 9 times out of 10 or 9.999 times out of 10, the ethnocide is going to precede the ecocide. And let's focus on the philosophies and the ideas that create ethnocide and all the other manifestations that come from it that are problematic.
God, your thoughts about that?
I agree with all of that. But I also just want to extend this in that there is a way to understand from a structural model what our system has been and is and what it needs to be. And again, this is of course, it's full circle. We need to return to indigenous wisdom, right? Which is fundamentally about local culture, an understanding of a connection to place. And the people that live there have that deep connection that is way beyond your need for a commodity or your white essence, right? But that fundamentally, the two models are the linear model, the cradle to grave model, right? Where something goes and extracts, turns it into a product, and then that thing goes to a dump somewhere. That's the linear model. You have to believe in ethnocide to drive the linear model. The other model, the indigenous wisdom model, is the cyclical model, the circular model, the one like circular economies, where you say, hey, you product provider, when you're done, when that product is end of use, you have to take it back. You got to reuse it, zero waste entirely. right? And they're pushing this. And then that waste stream doesn't go to where Barrett was saying earlier. Where does the waste go? And this is the fundamentals of environmental justice. Where does the waste go? Well, it goes where the people of color live. We don't want it here where the white people live. We want it where the people of color live, period. We're still doing it today. The problem, that specific problem, is just as bad today in 2022, if not worse, empirically, than it was when the first studies came out in the mid-'80s. We are more guaranteed to put that hazardous site in a community of color that's already suffering from cumulative impacts today than we were 40 years ago. That just shows you how far we have to go, but we have the answers, and that's circular economies, cradle to cradle thinking. That eliminates the waste streams and therefore the brownfields that need to go into communities of color. There is no bad site to go anywhere because you've engineered it out of the model. And that's the type of thinking that we need going forward. So I just sort of point that out and clarify the difference.
Yeah, Barrett, so what do you think about that relationship to how Scott just sort of framed it through the lens of environmental justice, which is, of course, connected indelibly to human dignity and environmental outcomes and disproportionate effects and so on and so forth. Do you think there's any way to reverse this or through an ethnocidal lens? Does it begin, as you point out in your book, with education, or does it begin with something more radical than that? Thank you.
Well, everything has to begin with education. Like, you can't do something adequately without the knowledge that precedes the action. So you have to have education. And, a key component that I talk about in the book regarding education is the language that we use. For example, Jimmy, you just asked, can we reverse it? Well, the answer is, of course, you can't reverse it. There's no time machines, but thinking you can do something in reverse is more of a linear way of looking at stuff where, if going forward is problematic, maybe we can go backwards and fix it, and then we'll go forward again. What we're really talking about is it's cyclical. Life is supposed to go on forever. It's a circle. There's no end. And so if we've been doing something really problematic for a very long time, we're going to have to consistently do work for generations constructively to incrementally fix those problems. Thinking you can go in reverse and fix it really quickly and then just go back to the status quo, that's never going to work. But that's how we like to think, because culturally we've been taught to think in this really linear way. It's funny what Scott's saying about the circular model. It seems radical to people because you're telling people that they can't waste things. And people, when they hear that they can't waste stuff, they're like, that's crazy. Of course I can waste things. It's just junk. And I'll put the junk over there and I won't have to look at it. And therefore it just disappeared. We're so indoctrinated in idea that it makes sense to waste stuff, to be wasteful, that when you tell someone that there's a way to live without just being inherently wasteful, they just can't even conceive of that being real. And that just speaks the nature of the problem. Here's a fascinating example, and we all kind of encounter this, but America's so accustomed to factories more than the land that if you get fruit and that fruit or product doesn't look perfect, the factory only allows the best ones to leave, it's totally common for someone to not want to eat something that's natural because it'll have a blemish on it. We are willing to waste perfectly good food that just may not look perfect because people aren't accustomed to eating food that looks natural because they think the fake version is natural. So and all of that stems from how you treat other people. You're not gonna, if you have a whole collective culture, it's gonna be really easy for people to say, hold up, that waste is gonna come back to my farm too, my this, whatever. And they'll just wanna figure out another way of doing it. In my book, I talk about this Dutch word polderen, and polderen it's just a staple of Dutch culture. But since they had to reclaim land to live on, every inch of that land that they unearthed from the North Sea is incredibly valued. You would even, if this was like indigenous American discourse, you'd say that land's sacred. And they therefore don't want to waste any of it. They don't want to have landfills. They don't want to use a bunch of pesticides, and they'll figure out a way to be really, really efficient and waste as little as possible. And like circular economy stuff is booming in the Netherlands because that's just how they are taught to think. And so we aren't taught to think like that because there are people and places in America that were built to be disposable. And I know Scott wants to jump in here, but like one real quick thing, and I don't, this kind of takes it from this conversation, but like we always talk about gun laws and gun rights in the US and people getting murdered and children, but we have a culture that is okay with guns because we're okay with a lot of people being considered disposable. And if disposing of certain people means people get to keep some inalienable rights, Americans have no hesitation saying that those rights are more important than other people's lives. And that's really, really troubling. But we say it all the time because that's how we've been taught to say and think.
Scott, go ahead. Your thoughts about that.
Well, I'll just say, invoking the recent tragedies, those tragedies don't happen if those shooters see the inherent human dignity in those human beings, right? If we haven't trained our children to understand that inherent human dignity, then we have failed, and as a society, and we really, really, really need to work on this. Now, I'll just say, I think we're all in mourning, and I can't even imagine what people are going through. But I will say that these sorts of tragedies, as horrific and acute as they are, Flint was just like that, just in slow motion. People were harmed forever, thousands of them, but it happened over one cup of water after another, not a bunch of bullets in a school. And there will, in the end of the day, be more people harmed in a situation like Flint than any of these shooting situations, as awful as that, that they all are. That 7,000 children were permanently poisoned in Flint. They have to have an entirely new educational curriculum to deal with the fact that they have this lead poisoning that has affected their cognitive abilities. I mean, this is just 7,000 children. Can you imagine your child who was absolutely dominating school and getting straight A's, and then suddenly they can't do their homework and forever they're changed? Can you imagine how that feels? That's ecocide and that's ethnocide. It's happening in America. It's happening all over America right now because our system, our capitalist system, our governance system are fundamentally set up that way. They are set up to be ethnocidal, and they are set up to privilege the white founding community of this country. They're built that way. So they see these as, like Barrett was saying, acceptable losses, and that's unacceptable. I'll leave it at that for now.
Well, yeah, let me just add one thing to that. And Scott pointed this out, a little while earlier before we got on the chat, but the area in Buffalo where the shooting happened about 2 weeks ago, that area was a food desert. It's a prominent Black community that's, America just didn't think that they needed access to healthy food or the environment. So there's not the land to grow your own food, and the people there are too poor for a grocery store to think it makes financial sense to be in that area. So they just get to live off of the snacks from the gas station. And so a grocery store showed up there, and this became one of the cultural gathering spots because this is where people can get healthy food to eat. Like, that's ecocide. The ethnocide preceded it because that was disposable people, disposable land. And then a white supremacist goes into that area and decides to shoot up all these Black people because he has anxiety that the presence of African people in America could result in that white people being replaced, even though white people brought Black people to America. They created the problem, and they can't handle the problem they own created, and now they will use terror to erase this people they consider to be disposable within the land that they created to be disposable too. And this incepts so much of just everyday American life that when we see the terror happen, we respond and say that we're speechless. But what we need are the words to fill that void so that we're no longer speechless. We can say that's ethnocide, that's ecocide, that's what we're talking about here. And then we can hopefully do things to change our society.
Well, and I just want to say, ethnocide is the model. Okay. So that's the way the system has been working. And so when we try to change things on the margins, we're not really getting at it. And I think, that's a really big part of the issue here, but also that ethnocide is ingrained in every American as an acceptable truth, that this is just an okay model, that doing this sort of commodification of everything is what you're allowed to do. And our language has been corrupted. And Barrett, of course, is one of the great leaders on this conversation, the corrupting of our language. And I just slipped and did one myself, calling the United States of America, America, as if all those other places in those continents are not, go ahead, Barrett.
See, that's actually a thing where the slip up is mostly due to the fact that there's actually an absence of an adequate cultural term for our society. We could say the United States, but the problems that we're talking about existed before the United States became a country. So when we're talking about ethnocide, we're talking about something that happened from the slave trade. The ecocide, that's also the slave trade. That's pre the United States. And since we are a society about destroying culture, there's not a cultural, normalized term for the culture that we have. That's not just the name of a nation. And since ethnocide and ecocide occurred all across both of the Americas, we are talking about something that happens all across two continents. But as Americans, linguistically, we're at a disadvantage to even describe the culture of our own society, because that's not a thing America has really entertained to think about, because our society has existed to destroy culture. You don't name the thing you think shouldn't exist.
Yeah, the culture we've developed is profiting or winning, right? When you talk about culture, the only thing we hear about it in the United States is the culture of winning in a sports team.
Right. But even that winning, we do things that in the grand scheme of things, we lose. It's winning from the perception of the bad guy. So that's not accurate either. And so it's a complicated dilemma that we all face, strangely enough, to describe the society in which we live and the culture that is within that society.
Or would you say it's a worldwide dilemma as well? I mean, thinking about examples that you mentioned in your book as well. The New York Times recently had just on Sunday had a multi-part story about Haiti, and which seems to be kind of a quintessential juxtaposition of ecocide and ethnocide, where the Haitian environment was used to pay off what the French treated as a loan, and then U.S. Profiteers and banks made money off of that even, and what's left is a barren country. And again, that's an extension of ethnocide and ecocide.
Yeah. So the thing is, for my book, I tried to focus almost as much as possible on the United States, just so it didn't get too big. Because when you're talking about the destruction of culture and that has an attachment to place, there's clearly going to be different manifestations in the different places because those places are different. Like Haiti versus the United States, one of the biggest differences there is just like the percentage of enslaved people in Haiti and the size of Haiti. It's not easy, but logistically, it's possible to push all the Europeans into the sea if you're an island. It's also much easier for those Europeans to get on boats and surround that island and say, we will impoverish you if you don't give us stuff because we have boats and your boats won't be able to get off the island. That's a relationship that's able to happen because of the environment. The United States has had countless slave rebellions, more than you could even imagine, but the size of the United States made it really hard for any of those rebellions to result in the British being forced off of the United States. This is a place the size of a continent. And so wherever colonization took place and this European notion of like chattel slavery and the view that people outside of Europe just aren't human beings, yeah, an iteration of ethnocide without a doubt took place in those places. How it manifests, how it's unique to that place is going to be, descriptive to that place. I will also say, it's funny, if I ever talk to an Irish person about ethnocide, the first thing that comes out of their mouth is, that's what the British did to us. And so it's not just, like it can happen in many different places. It's just once you have the language, you can then articulate what you see and then start talking about the nuances of how it manifests. But it's not some cookie cutter thing where it looks exactly the same every place, but you know it when you see it, because that's what's happening.
Sure. Thanks, Scott. Did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Well, in America, just as the influence of corporate America and our history just means we are particularly good at ethnocide. So it's a ripe source for Barrett to have covered. But I'll also just say that Haiti was abused post freedom because we couldn't, and Barrett's written eloquently about this, but because the ethnociders couldn't let the word out that these valueless sort of savages could actually mount a full-scale counterinsurgency and take back their island from the powerful French, right? That word gets out, that would have been devastating. Go ahead, Barrett.
Yeah, my family is from Charleston, South Carolina, and Charleston, since it's one of the biggest slave ports in America, it was weirdly, you could say, almost cosmopolitan in a certain sense, where like news from other parts of the world would trickle into Charleston. And so when the Haitian Rebellion happened, Black people all across Charleston learned all about it. That made them wake up and say, oh my goodness, we could do this. Like this could happen. At the bare minimum, we could escape from Charleston and go to Haiti. And I had ancestors that did that. Like when the Civil War broke out, they got on a boat and went to Haiti. So there was a concerted effort amongst white people in the United States to not let word of the Haitian Rebellion trickle into the United States at all, because they felt that would embolden enslaved people and potentially could overthrow the United States. And so, there is no ambiguity of what the agenda was within these ethnocidal societies to sustain that division that they felt was quite profitable while destroying people and destroying the environment.
Yeah, it's such an interesting connection of the U.S. history and the way we think about it, like in 1800 with the Alien and Sedition Act and what John Adams was doing by appointing all these officers of the peace, like Marbury. But a big concern was about rebellion, slave rebellion at the time because of what was happening in Haiti. So let me bring it back to, if I could, or thank you, by the way, those of you who are participating by listening in. Thank you for your comments in the chat. Thank you for your questions. Let me get to some of the questions and throw it out there to Barrett and Scott, which is first, is there two things. What can individuals do to address or redress ethnocide and ecocide? And secondly, is one of the things that can be done, I'll put it in the passive voice, is to make laws that criminalize ecocide. Thank you.
I'll go first. So I get some iteration of this question every time when someone reads the book. And the thing that's interesting is when you have the language and you have the philosophy that precedes the language, the goal is that new wisdom that the individual has will empower them to start crafting what's necessary for that specific place. We don't have laws talking about ethnocide because no one knows what it is. But once someone knows what it is and can, discuss and figure out and examine how it is impacting people, then you can start crafting laws with that language. Then you can start having policy discussions, just discussions with your friends and family about that language. And that's how change happens organically and in a sustainable way. There's not a one size fits all way of doing it. But once you have the language and the philosophy, you'll be surprised at how capable you are of making that change. And if you are someone who does policy, you can make that change in that area. I'm not a lawyer, but I met Scott, and he's a lawyer, and said, this work is important in the legal sense. You need to participate with the ABA. And so now I'm doing this type of stuff. And I'm having conversations with prominent lawyers all the time about ethnocide. And so the way to make the change is to speak the language and see the world with those words in it. And then as you do more and more things, there's a greater likelihood that those words will be in what you do. And that's how change happens.
Yeah, it's very interesting. What I think in terms of codifying or creating a law around ecocide, domestically or internationally, I think what's lacking is, and this is what spurred this conversation to everyone here, that this is really the root of it, which is, well, where's the humans in that? And if you look at that definition of ecocide, again, the humans are lacking. And so I'm not to disparage that definition and that effort, it's all great, but I would say that it is missing what Barrett's speaking about. And this is why his book is called The Crime Without a Name. It needs to be named because it is actually the precursor, in most cases, to the ecocide that we're seeing. And if we can address the ethnocide, the root of it, ecocide becomes a simpler solution and more obvious to everyone. So I would just say, I think that's a really key part. But in terms of environmental justice, one of the issues we deal with is that the environmental protection regime in America and in most other places is all about quantifying pollution. It's saying, yeah, a certain amount of pollution is fine. And yeah, those people, like, they can deal with like a certain amount of parts per million and it's all fine. It's this commodification of pollution that couples with the commodification of nature. That whole model is what has failed here, but also in the environmental justice realm, because environmental protection is too much about those quantified numbers and not about the qualified experience of the people who are actually living with these scenarios, right? And so ecocide, without understanding ethnocide, is also leaving out the qualified experience of the humans who are experiencing ecocide in their cultural home, right?
Okay, so again, thank you for that too, Scott. Scott, if we could turn to kind of a recent manifestation of, again, this junction of ecocide and ethnocide with the desal decision in California that you were involved with. If you wouldn't mind talking about that.
Yeah, briefly, it was a large private $685 billion large private equity company with $100 million of Latham Watkins attorneys deciding to put a massive polluting industrial facility in a community already known as the toxic triangle. Okay, so when I say this, my story is not unique. Well, it is unique in terms of the end of the story, or at least more rare. But it's not unique in the overall tale, which is a very large company finding a sacrifice zone, meaning an area of lower income, communities of color, indigenous communities that are already suffering from cumulative impacts from industrial activities all around them. Let's add another. Why not? Right? That is the phenomenon that is happening all over the place. But back to the beginning of what I've been saying, because the private equity company sees water, especially desalinated water, as the new commodity horizon. That's the new gold. Water is the new gold. So watch out, everyone, for these private entities trying to come in and control your water sources with industrial processes. But where are those industrial processes going to take place? Of course, in sensitive communities of concern, right? So the unique part, or at least the more rare part, is that the communities that were affected by this in a very broad coalition called the Stop Poseidon Coalition were able to come together and voice their concerns over years of concerted activism and advocacy in front of many different California agencies, but culminating in the California Coastal Agency, what was now 2 weeks ago, where the Coastal Agency unanimously rejected the corporate effort to add another polluting industry in this place that would have affected EJ communities far and wide. Tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of EJ community members would have been affected by this plant. And the commission, this what is known as by some to be the most powerful agency in California, said, no industry, no private equity, no, you did this wrong. You could have done it right. There were ways to do it right, where you would have worked with the community and worked with the indigenous folks, and you would have worked with the agencies and the city councils and tried to find a yes, but you didn't. You treated people as if they were disposable, and you treated that place as if it was disposable. And the true history of that place is that the native community is from that area. That area of estuary/wetlands was particularly the most sacred site, because it was where the ocean and the fresh water and the land and the sky came together to provide rich, vast resources for that community. And that's right where they were going to put this massive fossil fuel sucking industrial facility that would kill more marine life than any other predator in the sea. And the state said no on EJ and tribal and marine life concerns. And so that outcome is rare. It's beautiful that it happened. I was thrilled to be the attorney for the EJ communities, and that was all great. And this was incredibly heavy lifting. The activism started 22 years ago to try to stop this thing. I mean, you know, these are very difficult, and communities of color and indigenous communities across the country don't all have the type of support and the coalition building that we had. And so they get steamrolled, and those permits get granted, and those industrial facilities go into that sacrifice zone. And it's happening all over the country. Permits are getting granted, folks. We are the rare exception where we stopped a permit and we stopped a nasty facility from going in. Great, good for us. There's thousands, though, that get granted all day long. So I just say, and that was a perfect example of the commodifier having no regard for the communities of concern. I mean, literally, they pretended like they didn't exist. I mean, explicitly, they said there are no EJ communities affected by this plan. Despite us showing an EJ screen, California's and EPA level showing just how many cumulative impacts were involved here, just how many people would be affected, they kept coming out one after another. There are no EJ effects here. Okay, that's the problem. And that, fortunately, was what California shut down. And I think it's a beautiful time where we finally have some purchase in the law here. The laws that were passed by the state of California and many other states, New Jersey, New York, kudos to a lot of the states that have been passing EJ laws, but they're new and they haven't been tested. I would say that this was a stress test of the California EJ laws, and they were strong, and their tribal consultation laws and the California Coastal Commission's own EJ and tribal law policies. That's all exciting. That's all really good. And I think California often leads the way in terms of the positive EJ results. And so hopefully this is a harbinger of more to come. But this is an example of something that is happening in every city and community in America. Some private extractor is trying to come in and put something nasty in an EJ community. Again, another one. And stepping up as a coalition, and here, final thing I'll say on this is, one of the key ways that this coalition won is that it brought a very broad coalition of folks together, including very wealthy, predominantly white landowners, who also saw the effects of this in a number of categories and a number of reasons being a bad project. But we also brought the hardcore environmentalists that don't see anything about EJ in their work. They see that's a different lane. We brought that into, right? You have to bring a massive coalition of folks together to sort of push back on these at the agency level. But I will say the public participation opportunities, which is pillar of environmental justice, now are more than I've ever seen in my 15-year EJ career. And I've never been more excited about what we can do to yield environmental justice results going forward in the state of California, but also in the many states who are right there with us at the front end.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you for your work and for sharing it with everyone. I have a follow-up question, but before I turn to it, Barrett, do you have any comments about what happened with the desal proposal in California that Scott just mentioned?
I think Scott summed it up pretty well.
Absolutely. I mean, it perhaps shows that there's still hope in just fighting back or protesting and challenging, Scott. So thank you again. So Barrett, a question from the Q&A that returns us a little bit to what to do about it part. So again, sorry for returning to that, but the question is about really, I think it gets to reparations, and this is related. I think it's a general question, but it could relate to the situation in Haiti or anywhere in the world. But the question Solomon asks is, how can we achieve justice for communities and ecosystems that have been negatively affected by actions of persons that are revealed more and more as time goes on? About atrocities from the past that have their root in ethnocide. So any thought about what to do about it? Is there a role for reparations, for example?
Yeah. So I think one thing that we have to recognize, and Germany might be a pretty good example, but if we look at the Holocaust, the Holocaust spanned a little more than a decade. This isn't to trivialize it in any way. It's an atrocity. There's nothing trivial about that. But what we have noticed is that Germany has spent decades collectively as a society trying to teach everyone the horrors of what occurred during that time. They've encouraged people to look and see if their family profited off of that time, and if so, they need to do things to donate money to organizations and all sorts of stuff. There's a national education understanding in addition to giving reparations to victims of the Holocaust. And so what we're talking about when it comes to healing from traumas that, if we're being completely honest, we're talking about trauma that have been waged for centuries. It's not going to be a thing where you do reparations, return land or whatnot, and it gets solved in 10 years. It's a cultural shift that has to occur. And that cultural shift is going to have the language and philosophy to sustain that shift for a long time, where people are thinking better ways and talking in better ways and doing better things. And so, yes, of course, you can provide reparations, and it makes sense. And places in the U.S. are already addressing that. But that's not going to be, a solution for everything. I hate this phrase, but America uses it all the time, and we still think this way, where we're looking for silver bullets, where in America, a pristine implement of destruction, a silver bullet that can go through, multiple bodies and kill a lot, that's an efficient solution. It solves everything. That's how we describe stuff here. We're not looking for that. We're looking for something holistic that transcends the current limitations. And you can only do that through new philosophies and language, in addition to practical means such as giving reparations to people in Evanston, Illinois, returning land to people that it was unjustly taken away, stuff like that. So it's more encompassing.
And there's also just, we're lawyers. A lot of us are lawyers here. There are other critical legal doctrines that exist that need to be developed further, but I'll just name one: disgorgement for unjust enrichment, right? All of those companies that intentionally committed ecocide because of their commitment to ethnocide, those absolutely should be disgorged of those profits, and those profits should be managed in a trust to facilitate the communities in every single instance across the planet. And that is the type of reparations from an ecocide standpoint that will be required. And I say required because there is not enough government money in the world to solve all of the problems that corporate industry has created all over the planet. We need corporate money to come back to clean up the graveyards that their linear model created. Okay, it's not just okay for us to switch to the circular model and say, oh, that old model's dead. Yeah, it's dead. It left graveyards all over the world, and you got to clean them up, and you got to go fix them. And they're not just environmental sites that are so toxic. They are essentially a huge graveyard for the earth, for the Mother Earth. But there's actual graves with real humans that have died. The Chevron Ecuador case, these Chevron people and their lawyers, they literally, thousands of people have died, lost their lives because of their business operations, and they have not paid a penny, despite a adjudicated result in Ecuador all the way to their Supreme Court ruling that they needed to pay to clean that thing up. Go ahead, Barrett.
So just to piggyback on what Scott just said, because that's exactly the type of thinking that you need, because this is how you can do it through litigation or through legislation, where reparations are a process of trying to repair the damage that has been done. We think about reparations where you're damaging a people or a culture, and it's a government obligation. But there are corporations that go out and they damage the environment and they damage people's lives. And we're not articulating reasons why they need to have an obligation to repair the damage that in many ways is just their core business model. Like, that's the bold thinking that you need to have as you're trying to change the entire dynamic and start talking about reparations, where, like, if we're looking at the idea of reparations in the first place, when that first came out, that was revolutionary. That was a concept that, what are we talking about here? Like, as we look at Haiti and we look at even the emancipation in Washington, D.C., reparations were more commonly an idea that you would provide reparations to the slave owner for no longer having enslaved people. The idea of providing reparations to formerly enslaved people because they were punished and that they lived in the country, that's a revolutionary idea. That's a completely new take on reparations. And so if we're talking about reparations, we can start talking about what Scott just said, where these corporations need to pay these types of reparations because that's what they are. They need to repair the damage of what they've done to society and the world. And this makes sense. And so these are the bold conversations you're able to have with, like, a slightly modified linguistic philosophical conversation. And you will surprise yourself at the legislative and litigation ideas you can come up with.
And from a legal perspective, the key terms here are access to justice and access to remedy, right? That we need to create those pathways so that justice can be achieved and that remedy can go to the communities that need it. And we need to find those methods, but it's not going to be governments that are going to have to clean this up. It's going to have to be the legacy of corporations that step in to clean up this toxic history.
So let me follow up about this toxic history part of it and what to do about it and the legacy and everything. I'm channeling a question from the Q&A again. Thank you, everybody, for these fantastic questions and the just terrific conversation in the chat. You're really putting me through my paces as moderator, and I love that. Thank you. What to do to, who can be held to account? So one of the questions is, how is it that Chevron and before that Texaco and Petroecuador and all that got away with all this? Is there any way to hold them to account financially or some other way? And this is related as well to the climate change question, which, this is no easy question about what to do, in the reparations context with climate change. So the Human Rights Commission of the country of Philippines just issued a finding after studying questions about climate change for 5 years, and for the first time reached the merits of climate change. The first time in an adjudication reached this question as to who's at fault, who caused this. And they found, what we might expect, that, carbon majors, if you will, are not only responsible, but they played a huge role in changing the climate of the planet. They knew they were doing that. They did that, and they've known for more than 50 years. They profited from it. Their shareholders profited from it. They kept that information from the public. And when it started to get public, they squelched it. They supported candidates in political office all over the world who in essence, we're engaged in kind of a kind of climate, sorry, Barrett, for using this expression, kind of a climate ethnocide, not to mention ecocide. So getting back to the question, is there a way legally, Scott, let me ask you, to hold corporations accountable?
The answer is unequivocally no. Corporations are now not multinational. Corporations are supranational. They are bigger and more powerful than any one domestic nation could possibly hope to manage. That's what we have now. The Chevron Ecuador is just one perfect example of that. The Ecuadorian government, I mean, their entire judicial system weren't able to hold Chevron to account, despite the rulings over and over and over against Chevron. The American courts were the opposite of a place to hold them account. In fact, the American courts were a safe haven for the corporation who came running to them after the judgment was rendered in Ecuador. In fact, the United States court system is soon to become a global pariah where corporations can come here and find that safe haven, just like Chevron did, despite rulings like we're seeing in places like the Netherlands, the UK, France, et cetera, that are in support of these oil majors paying up and doing what's right. So the answer is absolutely not. We have lost the international legal community. The domestic legal communities have lost the ability to hold oil majors to account, period. They can do anything they want with impunity. And you know why that is? Let me just give one more piece about this as we wrap up. The attorneys who represent them, the Gibson Dunns of the world, the Latham and Watkins of the world, these firms they dress up in their perfect suits as if they are embodiments of American exceptionalism and everything that is good about this nation. And they cover and they create the legal schemes to get these corporations out of accountability. And they are genius at it. And that's why they charge $1,200 to $2,400 an hour. That's why our friends here at the ABA are charging $1,200 an hour if they're at Latham and Watkins, because these corporations pay for that avoidance. Right. So our profession is complicit in this complete lack of accountability that we've created here in our system. And so it is ours also to fix that. And it starts with calling things out. And as Barrett says, naming it where we don't have words. But as I say, calling these people out. You, my colleagues, who keep defending the Chevrons and the Exxons of the world, stop it. Stop it. You're contributing to ecocide and ethnocide all over the planet. You are contributing. That's why this stuff persists. That's why we're not able to hold them to account time and time again.
So I'll just add this bit to it. One of the things that I find really inspirational about the word ethnocide is that Raphael Lemkin coined it along with genocide. And prior to Lemkin, who was a lawyer, coming up with the term genocide, there wasn't any sort of legal structure for punishing countries when they just systematically decided to destroy their own people. That wasn't an idea in international law, but it became one because a guy came up with a word to describe something that he innately knew was bad. And then that word created legal structures, and he then was able to talk to people at the United Nations. And now there's a whole everything to prevent genocide. We all know this is we all know the word now. We all actively have places that work to combat genocide. That was because one person had a word and then did the subsequent steps to make what was previously considered okay no longer acceptable. And so right now, no, when it comes to punishing corporations, we don't have the structure to do so. We also don't have the language to really concretely articulate why it's so bad, what they're doing in many cases. So the first step is using the language, which Scott and I both agree, ethnocide and ecocide are the foundational components of that necessary new language that needs to get cultivated. Scott and I haven't drafted everything yet. I just published my first book, so there's more writing to come. But what I will say is we're also talking about like a philosophical, psychological problem, because when you think of colonization, these European countries went out around the world to make corporations, like Jamestown in the United States, that was part of the London Company. And so America's first colony was a corporation. And so when you live in a place that doesn't want to have authentic culture, that just wants to destroy culture, and that thing that's destroying culture is a corporation, they're going to teach people that the company is their culture and that they can't survive without that company. And so Americans don't want to punish companies because we don't have the confidence that we can survive without them, even though we're aware that they're harming us. And so this conversation about culture and what culture looks like, and that culture is more than being attached to a company, that awareness right there helps make people realize that, you know what, it is possible for me to live without this company. It is possible that we should punish this company. And if that means that that company that's really detrimental to the environment and myself no longer exists, then that's okay anyways, because we do know that most companies do fail. So the anxiety we have about something that we expect organically will happen, but we don't want it to happen even when they are harming people, that's because we don't have a cultural foundation that extends before corporations, which that's just so dystopian.
So let me, if I could, we're down to the home stretch here. And two just final questions, one for you, Scott, and then you can also add anything else that you'd like to in response to what Barrett just said. But I'd ask each of you to provide your answers in about a minute, if you could. First, Scott, for you is this role of greenlining. What do you see with the relationship between ethnocide and greenlining? And there's an earlier question about how to link lawyers with ecocide redressing projects. And Barrett, for you, if you wouldn't mind providing some commentary on the role of human dignity in framing these kinds of questions going forward. What do you see dignity as bringing to the table in addressing or redressing ethnocide? So Scott, you first. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Well, I think if we don't understand ethnocide and we don't really essentially learn from Barrett and a lot of the scholars that have put this together for us to understand, then we're going to get things like greenlining, which is a term I put together, and Barrett and I have yet to draft the full document. But greenlining is the new redlining. As states have to roll out all this new sustainable development and climate mitigation and all these sorts of things, the ethnociders are going to be greenlining. They will be using those projects to further divide communities of color and indigenous communities from urban centers and other resources and other access points. But they'll also use it to literally just kick out communities of color. They will say, oh, well, it's not sustainable anymore. You're going to have to move. And sorry, we're going to turn it into this beautiful green space and this beautiful park. Oh, and it just so turns out that all the wealthy people are up the hill. Yeah, their view is going to get a lot better because there's nobody being in front of them. And it's going to, and their property value is going to go way up. But believe me, that's not why we're doing it. We're doing it because of the sustainability stuff. And yeah, oh, we're so sorry you have to move. It's just those low-lying people, oh man, it's so sorry. Oh, well, you were there because of redlining in the first place. Oh, well, yeah, that was previous administrations. There's not much we can do about that. So my point is, we've already proven that all of these horrific sites are still the same model, same calculus is happening. Where are the communities of color? That's where we're going to cite them. Well, greenlining is going to be used as a sword, and it's going to be used abusively against communities of color when we do not understand ethnocide and root that out. Barrett?
Perfect. And so to answer Jimmy's question, and maybe I don't know if I remember it entirely, but the key thing for human dignity and pertain to ethnocide is, I'll leave you with this African proverb. The phrase, it's called Ubuntu, and it translates as "I am because we are." Europeans like this phrase, I think, therefore I am, but this African one speaks to the fact that like I'm a person because I can see that we are people together. Like I'm a human being because I can see your humanity and I can trust that you can see mine too. This is a radical idea in the westernized world in the United States, but it's a philosophy that stemmed from human dignity being the root of everything. And right now we have logic that just doesn't have dignity and in it at all. And then we just unsurprisingly create societies based around doing undignified things in perpetuity. And so this little shift from I think, therefore I am to I am because we are, that's revolutionary. That helps you see things differently. It helps you put dignity, human dignity at the forefront of your mind. And this helps you navigate through the world in an entirely different way. And so this is a way to do it. And that's one way I recommend.
Well, thank you so much, Scott. And thank you, Barrett. And let me thank everybody for joining this terrific conversation. We'd like to express our gratitude to the American Bar Association Center for Human Rights, the American Bar Association Dignity Rights Institute, and the Section on Civil Rights and Social Justice. And with a reminder on that, the Section on Civil Rights and Social Justice provides free webinars and resources for legal professionals and advocates nationwide. And we hope that this free webinar helps you in your work. And again, if you can, please consider joining and becoming active in the ABA and active within the Center for Human Rights and the Section of Civil Rights and Social Justice. So with that, let me thank our esteemed panelists, Scott Badenoch and Barrett Holmes Pittner, again for this conversation about confronting ecocide and achieving environmental dignity. And let me thank all of you. And I hope that you stay safe, be well, and enjoy what's left of the week. Thank you so much. So long.